As an introduction to the Gospel according to Lois Cole, I have a reading from Thresholds by John O'Donohue. To change is one of the great dreams of every heart, to change the limitations, the sameness, the banality, or the pain. So often we look back on patterns of behavior, the kinds of decisions we make repeatedly and that have failed to serve us well, and we aim for a new, more successful path or way of living. But change is difficult for us. So we often opt to continue the same old pattern rather than risking the danger of difference. We are also often surprised by change that seems to arrive out of nowhere. We find ourselves crossing some new threshold we had never anticipated. Like spring secretly at work within the heart of winter, below the surface of our lives, huge changes are in fermentation. We never suspect a thing. Then when the grip of some long-enduring winter mentality begins to loosen, we find ourselves vulnerable to a flourish of possibility, and we are suddenly negotiating the challenge of a threshold. At any time, you can ask yourself, at which threshold am I now standing? At this time of my life, what am I leaving? What am I about to enter? What is preventing me from crossing the next threshold? What gift will enable me to do it? To acknowledge and cross a new threshold is always a challenge. It demands courage and also a sense of trust in whatever is emerging. No threshold need be a threat, but rather an invitation and a promise. Whatever comes, the great sacrament of life will remain faithful to us, blessing us always with invisible signs of invisible grace. We merely need to trust. Here's Lois.
Yay. I wanted to use this slide as an illustration with my sermon because several years ago, when I was starting my parish internship in Orlando at the Unitarian Church there, I needed it to fulfill a seminary requirement. The first Sunday I was there, I was introduced to members of the congregation in the committee fair called the Fiesta of Opportunities. And next to my spot in the library was this signpost that someone from my internship committee had fashioned. Mike knew I had lived in a number of places, and he thought it might provide an avenue for conversation. And it did. We talked about what brought my parents to Taiwan, what it was like to live in Pakistan as a woman, whether I had gone to Hong Kong, back to Hong Kong after the changeover to China, what came of my studying fiction in Iowa. When people exclaimed that I had really lived in a lot of places, I couldn't disagree. I was certainly being reminded of that, but a traveler, someone who easily uproots and goes somewhere else, had not been my identity for a while. It was a big deal that I had moved from Iowa City to Orlando. In fact, I had one of those signs is Iowa City, where I had lived for 17 years and had been at the same workplace, the Unitarian Universalist Society, for the last 15. So at that moment, I was aware that I had developed a different relationship with change. I had developed a pretty uneasy relationship with change. I marveled at my younger self, all that moving, such courage, such instinct or insight, or was it just youthful recklessness? It wasn't as if I had made my decisions completely on a whim. I could see the influence of my missionary upbringing. I grew up in a seminary campus in Taiwan, where my parents worked as Methodist missionaries. There I developed a love for cultures and languages and for worship. In teaching English abroad, I had followed my mother's footsteps, and later as a seminarian and religious educator in my father's. I could also see moments of providence which seemed to occur at those times of restlessness, like when I met an Iowan on a train in China. He was knitting, which was in striking contrast to his cowboy boots and his cowboy hat. During our conversation, he learned I was searching for a new path, and he helped me identify an old passion I had, creative writing. I know a nice little writing community in Iowa City, he had said. The seed took hold, and a year later, I found myself doing an MFA program in the Writers' Workshop in Iowa City. Providence struck again. There I made friends with Jennifer, a Unitarian Universalist who somehow forgot that Unitarians do not proselytize. That was good timing. Involvement in religious community had always been important to me, but I had outgrown, or I shouldn't say I had outgrown, I no longer felt comfortable in my Protestant faith. After graduating, I took a position as a director of religious education at the Unitarian Universalist Church, which seemed a perfect fit. At that time, it seemed like everything in my life had been a preparation for it. And then 5 years into my work, I was discovering a new stirring within me, a call to be a minister. I chose to do part-time studies with our UU seminary in Chicago while I was doing full-time work, which my job kept expanding with programs at the church. So those studies took 10 years. That's a long time to be in a seminary. In fact, I was one of 3 who had the notoriety of being the last to graduate in our program before it was given a proper eulogy and buried. So another program had taken its place that was graduating people within 4 years tops. So I wondered why it took me so long. Was it because my work was still meaningful? It was comfortable. It was familiar, as was Iowa City, where I had significant ties. To finish my studies, I would have to leave what was comfortable and familiar. I would have to leap into the unknown, live on a stipend, apply for work. I would have to go where there would be a job for me as a minister, which likely wouldn't be Iowa City. So the stakes were high. It seemed my call to ministry was competing with my desire to stay safe. But interestingly, a few crises came up in my life. A flood, a work crisis, and my school sounding the alarm bells that it was time for me to graduate. Isn't that how it works when we're so stuck? The universe gives us a big kick. Since Orlando, I've added 2 more places to my signpost. Des Moines, where another turn in my path led me to chaplaincy, where I did a chaplaincy residency here, and which resulted in returning to Iowa City, but as a pediatric chaplain in the university hospitals there. I have to say I've gotten familiar with change over the 3 years, these 3 or 4 years, and I don't like it still. Change is hard. Yet, with so much change, I have regained something of my youthful past. I've regained a kind of a trust that somehow in jumping into the unknown, it will all work out, as you spoke about this morning. Times of transition, of entering a new threshold, are difficult for many of us. It can be a confusing time as we realize the old territory, the old roadmaps, in the new territory, the old roadmaps don't apply. We grieve what we have left behind and fear what we are entering because it seems like we're lonely voyagers heading into the unknown. Yet somehow we are not as alone as we think we are. Some of our new beginnings have been in preparation for a while. Risk may be our greatest ally, says spiritual teacher John O'Donohue. To live a truly creative life, we always need to cast a critical look at where we presently are, attempting always to discern where we have become stagnant and where a new beginning might be ripening. There can be no growth if we do not remain open and vulnerable to what is new and different. I have never seen anyone take a risk for growth, he says, that was not rewarded 1,000 times over. A common narrative about risk and the spiritual journey that shows up in dramas and storytelling and myths and religious rituals over the centuries is used by spiritual directors often and psychologists to explore the spiritual journey. It's called the hero's journey. It goes like this. Something shakes up the hero situation, either external pressures or something rising up from deep within. So the hero must face the beginnings of change. The hero feels the fear of the unknown and tries to turn away from the adventure, however briefly. But eventually, she commits to leaving the ordinary world and entering a new region or condition with unfamiliar rules and values. She may encounter tests and allies and enemies. Near the middle of the story, the hero enters a central space in the special world and confronts death or faces her greatest fear. Out of the moment of death comes a new life, and the hero takes possession of the treasure won by facing death. Eventually, the hero returns home or continues the journey bearing some element of the treasure that has power to transform the world as the hero has been transformed. For the simple fact that we are alive and must sometimes face our fears, multiple losses, and ultimately our death, we are all on a hero's journey. Even when we resist change, it comes to us, and not always for the better. I see this all the time in the hospital, people's lives transformed in an instant, a threshold suddenly opening up for which they've had no preparation due to illness, suffering, or loss. I have companioned many patients and families as a pediatric chaplain during very difficult times, and I have felt inadequate in the face of what they're going through at times. From my work as a religious education director, I know that parents are happiest if their children are happy. And they are fierce and strong advocates for their children if their children's needs aren't being met. So what does a chaplain do when a parent can no longer save their child from a terminal illness? and yet is compelled to be the fiercest protector against all odds and in relinquishing their own self-care. Initially in my work, to compensate for feelings of helplessness, I found myself bringing gifts, bringing a lot of stuff. There are a number of gift donations that Spiritual Services receives, among them Birdie the Bear. Birdie comes with activities for every age group. Birdie puzzles, Birdie labyrinths, Birdie the Bear whiteboard with feeling word magnets to help young people identify how they felt and why. Birdie the Bear journals for tweens, and of course simply Birdie the Bear himself with a small backpack that could neatly fit crayons and an Oreo cookie. Each time I stood at the door of a patient's room and prepared to knock, bearing my gifts, I felt I was standing at the threshold and afraid to cross it into the unknown. I needed to remind myself of what I was taught as a student chaplain, that my main provision for a family is a ministry of presence. I was enough in myself. One definition of spiritual care is the care of the human spirit when faced with trauma, ill health, or sadness, and can include the need for meaning, for self-worth, to express oneself, for faith support, perhaps for rites or prayer or sacrament, or simply for a sensitive listener. In other words, a chaplain brings no agenda or goals, brings no aims for outcomes, no distracting gifts, but is compassionately present to a patient and family in whatever they are experiencing and whatever spiritual needs arise. As chaplains, we're trained not to fix or smooth things over, problem solve, or move things along. People need to live their experience. They need to process their anger or grief. They need to open their wounds. They need to connect with their own truth. They need to heal in the ways that they are, in their own time. It is their inner journey. It is their soul's journey to do. We can't walk in someone else's shoes. We can be a companion. There are times when I am reminded of how important this ministry of presence, companioning rather than fixing, is. Once I was called to attend to two young people, the ages of 12 and 14, whose mother was critically ill. I was with them when there was still hope, and then again when it became clear that she wouldn't make it, and a care conference was called. And then again, when she was going to be compassionately extubated. I had witnessed their journey from denial to preparation for her death, and that how they engaged in small rituals, playing their mother's favorite music, bringing flowers and pictures, writing notes, saying their private goodbyes, putting colorful nail polish on her fingernails. They and other members of their family had wanted me to lead them in a prayer after she was extubated. When a staff member spoke with the grandmother about whether it would be a good idea for the children to witness their mother's passing, I advocated for them when they said they wanted to stay. They had been present with their mother all along and needed to accompany her for the rest of the journey. Sometimes I think we forget how wise children can be, and that protecting them may not always be the best thing. Their mother died peacefully as we prayed over her, and in that room, amid deep grief and sadness, there was also a sense of grace with the sacred space we held. In companioning families, I marvel at those mysterious moments when some blessing emerges during the tragedy. The strength of an adolescent and loving acceptance of his parents who allow him to choose to stop aggressive treatment for metastatic cancer so that he can live what remains of his life in a large way. The peace of a grandmother with congestive heart failure who, after much wrestling, chooses aggressive treatment, knowing her days will be shorter, but she will have the quality of life she wishes to have with her family and her grandchild. Such moments leave me in awe of the human spirit and the great mystery undergirding life. No threshold need be a threat, says John O'Donohue, but an invitation and a promise, even in facing death. One thing that draws me to my faith, Unitarian Universalism, is that we have no fixed doctrine or creeds, but we do believe that revelation comes through personal experience. And throughout history, ours has been a tradition that seems to have accepted change and evolved to some extent, as I imagine is also true for unity. However, there are ways that we don't want to change, and there are ways that we are stuck and that change is slow in coming. It has taken us this long to address some deeper problems around white privilege and supremacy in our churches and dominance with our leadership. Now we have entered a new threshold that contains all the mess that comes with dismantling the old ways, but which brings the promise of wholeness and healing and a truer investment work in the justice work that we say is important to us. And what about unity? Is there a threshold that you are standing at, a beginning that may be a long time in preparation? And what about each of us? At any time you can ask, at what threshold am I now standing? What am I leaving? What is preventing me from crossing my next threshold? What gift will help? We have all crossed the threshold into a new year. The year is still young. How will we attend to the stirrings of our hearts, the profound or subtle openings in our lives? I would suggest that we start with blind trust. Trust will free us into a natural courage that casts out fear and opens up our lives to discovery, creativity, and promise. No threshold need be a threat, says John O'Donohue, but rather an invitation and a promise. Whatever comes, the great sacrament of life will remain faithful to us, blessing us always with visible and invisible grace. We need merely trust. So may it be.